She filed for divorce, walked into the courtroom with her boyfriend, and laughed until the judge read her husband's financial records. By the time the gavel dropped, she'd lost millions, her lover, and her future. Think you know how divorce court works? Think again. This isn't just a breakup. It's a masterclass in revenge. Daniel Whitaker never imagined he'd end up here, staring across a courtroom at the woman he once trusted with everything. Melissa used to say he was the love of her life. Now she stood beside another man, her fingers laced with his, smiling like she'd already won. 5 years ago, Daniel was a rising name in Chicago's construction industry. He'd built his business from the ground up after a devastating betrayal in his early 30s. An ex who drained his bank account and left him sleeping in a pickup truck. That chapter nearly broke him, but it also taught him a brutal lesson. Never build your empire without building a fortress around it. By the time Daniel met Melissa Hayes, he was cautious but hopeful. She was charming, energetic, and seemed to believe in his vision. They met at a fundraiser. She asked questions about his projects. She seemed impressed, not by the money but by the mission. Or so he thought. They married after a year of dating. At first, life felt good. Melissa played the supportive wife, attending events, posting pictures, smiling in all the right places. But behind closed doors, Daniel began to notice the distance. She became less interested in the business, more absorbed in social media and luxury trips she insisted were networking opportunities. Her credit card statements told a different story: designer labels, five-star hotels, and high-end dinners that Daniel wasn't invited to. Still, he gave her the benefit of the doubt. He'd been wrong before and didn't want to be wrong again. He had no idea she was already cheating with a man named Jason Miller. Jason was everything Daniel wasn't: loud, flashy, and broke. At 36, Jason had cycled through more jobs than apartments: car salesman, investment advisor, even a brief stint as a luxury concierge. But his real skill was manipulation. He knew how to spot wealthy, unhappy women, and Melissa fit the mold perfectly. Their affair started with flirtation at a wine tasting. Within weeks, Melissa was footing the bill for his lifestyle. A Rolex, a BMW, hotel suites, all paid for with Daniel's money. Jason saw Melissa as a retirement plan. He even bragged about it to friends. She divorces the guy, gets half, and I get the good life without the prenup. What neither of them knew was that Daniel had anticipated betrayal years before Melissa ever walked into his life. After his first heartbreak, he worked with his brother Samuel and an attorney named Grace Fulton to secure everything: his business, his home, even his investment accounts, behind layers of legal protection. On paper, Daniel owned very little. In reality, he controlled an empire. Melissa had no clue. She believed Daniel was too trusting, too distracted to see the red flags. So she made her move. One night she came home late, calm and rehearsed. She told Daniel it was over, said she was tired of playing house while he buried himself in work. Then came the threat: half of everything you built will be mine. You'll regret not appreciating me. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't cry or shout. He simply nodded and said, "Okay." That silence unnerved Melissa more than any outburst would have, but she chalked it up to shock. She left the next morning and filed for divorce within 48 hours. Jason was thrilled. He popped champagne in his downtown condo, already picking out condos in Miami. Melissa texted him, "It's done. He didn't even fight back." Jason smirked. Easy money. They had no idea what was coming. Melissa's lawyer was Ronald Chambers, known for high-profile divorces and aggressive tactics. At their first meeting, he was giddy. Based on Illinois community property laws, you're looking at a $4 million split. The house, the business, the cars, they're all fair game. Melissa smiled. It felt real now. She was about to become rich, independent, empowered, and upgraded. But what Chambers didn't know, and didn't bother to find out, was that Daniel's assets were structured in a way that made them virtually untouchable. No offshore trickery, no illegal dodges, just smart, airtight planning. Daniel's lawyer, Grace Fulton, was already preparing for war. Her downtown office didn't look like a law firm. It looked like mission control. Corporate flowcharts covered the walls. Trust documents were lined up like artillery. As Grace slid the divorce petition across Daniel's desk, she said, "Standard grab attempt. They think you're a sitting duck. Daniel didn't flinch. She has no idea, does she? Not a clue, Grace replied, flipping open a file labeled Whitaker Asset Protection. 7 years of planning, 7 years of patience, all about to pay off. Melissa and Jason thought they were walking into court to collect a fortune. They were actually walking into a trap. Jason Miller believed he was weeks away from a life most men only saw in magazines. Luxury condos, private jets, a Miami skyline outside his window. All he had to do was keep Melissa happy until her divorce came through. She'd already promised him the good life, half of her husband's empire, funneled through her, straight into their new shared account. Jason had no job, no savings, and no shame. For years, he'd survived by attaching himself to women who had more ambition than he did. Melissa was different, though. She wasn't just rich by association. She was married to wealth. All Jason had to do was wait. Meanwhile, Melissa's divorce attorney, Ronald Chambers, was preparing what he believed to be a bulletproof case. No prenuptial agreement, he told Melissa during one of their early meetings. No offshore accounts, no asset shielding. Based on what we've reviewed, you're entitled to at least $4 million. Melissa didn't ask many questions. She was too busy booking appointments to see luxury realtors in South Beach. Jason was already measuring the windows for custom drapes. They had plans, and in their minds, Daniel was just an obstacle. A rich man too stunned to resist. The court date was set. Melissa felt unstoppable. Jason's confidence bordered on arrogance. Men like Daniel don't fight, he told his friend Marcus over drinks. They hire lawyers, stall, then pay up. Jason laughed as he scrolled through pictures of yachts on his phone. But across town, Daniel wasn't stalling. He was strategizing. Grace Fulton and her legal team had already prepared everything. Daniel's home wasn't in his name. It was owned by the Whitaker Family Trust, created years before he met Melissa. The business, a legally separate entity, 51% owned by Daniel's brother Samuel, leaving Daniel a minority stakeholder. The luxury vehicles, registered under the company fleet, not individual property. The investment accounts, locked inside an irrevocable trust. Melissa was suing a man who legally didn't own any of the things she was after. And she had no idea Chambers, for all his experience, failed to run a deep check. His paralegals skimmed public records and saw dollar signs. They didn't look at ownership structures, didn't question the absence of personal assets, didn't ask why Daniel hadn't made a single move to contest the filing. They saw a vulnerable husband and assumed an easy win. The only community property Daniel had left exposed was a joint checking account with $150,000 and a few shared household items. Everything else was protected, documented, filed, and verified years in advance. Jason's fantasy life started early. He stopped job hunting, started borrowing money, and even made a down payment on a Miami penthouse. Money he didn't have based on funds he thought were guaranteed. He was already living the lifestyle on credit, telling friends he was about to come into serious cash. Melissa played along, feeding his ego, repeating what Chambers had told her. Daniel would cave. He'd settle. He'd write a check just to be done with it. 3 days before the hearing, Daniel met with Grace for the final review. They walked through every document again. Let them speak first, Grace advised. They'll think they're winning. We'll make sure they enjoy it right up until we take it all away. Melissa, meanwhile, was coaching herself in the mirror. She planned to cry on cue, look dignified, and appear heartbroken. Jason would sit quietly, watching the future unfold from the front row. Ronald Chambers rehearsed his speech. The hardworking wife, the cold husband, the emotional toll of neglect. All the cliches that usually worked on judges who'd seen too many divorce cases to count. But this wasn't going to be a typical case. Daniel didn't look like most men walking into court. He wasn't angry, defensive, or desperate. He was quiet, calm, and prepared. The morning of the hearing, Melissa arrived early with Jason at her side. Their confidence was visible. To them, this was just a formality, a final step before the wire transfer. Daniel arrived without fanfare, carrying a single folder. Ronald Chambers looked across the courtroom at Daniel and saw exactly what he expected, a man who didn't understand what was coming. He whispered to Melissa, "This will be over in an hour." Grace Fulton sat beside Daniel, expression unreadable. Her briefcase contained everything needed to dismantle Melissa's claims. The judge entered. Melissa straightened up. Jason gave her hand a squeeze. Whitaker versus Whitaker. Petition for divorce and division of assets. The judge read aloud. Chambers stood. Your Honor, my client seeks equitable distribution of assets totaling $4 million, including the marital home, family business, vehicles, and investment accounts. My client supported her husband's business endeavors and is entitled to half of the estate under Illinois law. The judge nodded. Defense? Grace rose, calm, methodical. Your Honor, we dispute the claim that these assets constitute community property. We are prepared to provide extensive documentation demonstrating that each item cited was secured under legally protected entities prior to the marriage. Melissa blinked. Chambers scoffed. Jason leaned forward, confused. Then Grace began unpacking the truth. Grace Fulton opened the folder with a steady hand and removed the first document. Your Honor, she said, this is the Whitaker Family Trust, established in March 2016, 2 years before Mr. Whitaker's marriage to the petitioner. She handed the papers to the clerk. The judge flipped through the notarized pages, examining the official stamps and signatures. Everything was in order. Melissa's confident posture shifted. Her attorney, Ronald Chambers, glanced at the paperwork with growing concern. Grace continued. The family residence, located at 847 Elmage Drive, was purchased in 2017 using funds from this trust. Legal ownership belongs to the trust, not Mr. Whitaker individually. Melissa blinked. Chambers tried to object, but paused when he saw the judge's expression. Grace wasn't bluffing. She had documents to back up every word. Next came the business records. Whitaker Brothers LLC was restructured in January 2016. Grace explained. Ownership is split, 51% held by Samuel Whitaker, 49% by Daniel Whitaker. This structure was filed and recorded before the marriage and qualifies as separate property under Illinois statutes. Chambers stood. Your Honor, this looks like a scheme to hide marital assets. The judge didn't look up. Do you have evidence to prove that claim, Mr. Chambers? No, but then sit down, Miss Fulton. Continue. Grace laid out the next stack. Vehicle titles, corporate fleet registrations, purchase dates. 10 luxury vehicles, all bought through the business after its restructure and legally owned by the LLC, not Daniel personally. Melissa's hand trembled as she reached for her water. Jason sat frozen. His breathing had gone shallow. The investment portfolios, Grace went on, are held in an irrevocable trust established before the marriage. Mr. Whitaker receives a monthly distribution for living expenses, but he does not, and legally cannot, withdraw from the principal. She placed the trust documents and bank statements on the bench. The judge read them in silence. The only remaining item subject to community division is the joint checking account, which currently contains $150,000. The courtroom was silent. Melissa stared straight ahead, processing every word. Her future was evaporating, line by line, signature by signature. Jason finally whispered, "What does this mean?" Chambers stood again. "Your Honor, we request time to review this new information." The judge shook her head. "These documents were submitted properly. Your client had ample time to perform due diligence." Melissa turned to Chambers. "But you said—" "I didn't see any of this," he muttered, flipping through his notes with a panicked energy. "None of it showed up in the initial review." "Because you didn't look deep enough," Grace said without even glancing his way. The judge looked at Melissa. "Mrs. Whitaker, your petition claims assets that were never part of the marital estate. Every major asset listed in your claim was legally secured years before your marriage began. Your attorney failed to identify that because he relied on surface-level filings instead of reviewing the ownership trail." Melissa opened her mouth but said nothing. Jason stood suddenly. "This is impossible," he said, half to the judge, half to himself. "She said he didn't have a prenup." "He didn't," Grace replied calmly. "He had something better. Planning." Jason walked out of the courtroom without another word. The judge turned back to the bench. "This court finds that the marital property subject to division includes only the joint checking account and any personal belongings acquired during the marriage. The petition for division of additional assets is denied." Melissa sat back, stunned. It was over. From an expected multi-million-dollar settlement, she was now left with less than $200,000. Chambers gathered his papers in silence, not daring to meet her eyes. Across the room, Daniel stood and buttoned his blazer. He gave a quiet nod to the judge and shook Grace's hand. No dramatic outburst, no smirk, just quiet finality. Melissa didn't even look at him as he walked out. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. But Daniel didn't speak to them. He got into a black SUV and drove away, back to the same house, same business, same life. Inside, Melissa remained seated. The courtroom slowly emptied. Her lawyer whispered something, then walked away. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jason. "I'm done. Good luck." The final cut. Melissa, who had entered court with dreams of penthouses and yachts, now sat alone at the petitioner's table, left with a used Honda, a pile of legal fees, and a future she never planned for. The judge's voice echoed one last time. Court is adjourned. 3 months after the courtroom collapse, Melissa Whitaker was no longer a name whispered over steak dinners or rooftop cocktails. She was just another tenant in a second-floor walk-up in Schaumburg, Illinois, trying to figure out how to stretch a rapidly shrinking bank balance into next month's rent. The $150,000 she walked away with had seemed like a consolation prize at first, until reality sank in. First came the legal fees. Ronald Chambers had billed aggressively despite the spectacular loss. Then came deposits for the apartment, cheap furniture, utilities, and insurance. Melissa still refused to buy secondhand, so she paid full price for everything. Within weeks, nearly half the settlement was gone. The Honda Civic she'd driven away from the courthouse was already making unfamiliar noises. Repairs were overdue, but she couldn't afford to take it in. The BMW Jason used to drive, registered in her name, had vanished with him. She didn't even have the energy to report it stolen. She just stopped making the payments and let the lender come collect it. Her phone buzzed less and less. Friends she once vacationed with were suddenly busy. Networking events dried up. Nobody wants to do lunch with a woman who lost everything in front of a judge. The whispers that followed her were brutal. Gold digger who got outplayed. Thought she'd marry up, got taken down. It didn't matter if they were true, they stuck. Jason, who'd once promised her a life of luxury, disappeared the day after the verdict. He took the Rolex she bought him and the money he'd borrowed for the Miami condo. He never called, never apologized. His last message was short. "Can't do broke, take care." Melissa later heard from a mutual friend that Jason had resurfaced in Phoenix, working construction under a different name. Rumor was he was dodging creditors tied to the penthouse deposit he'd financed on fantasy money. Melissa tried not to care, but sometimes late at night, she would search for him online just to see if he was still hiding. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't hide at all. His life went on, untouched. The home she used to live in was still his. The business never flinched. In fact, Whitaker Brothers Construction opened a new project site just weeks after the final ruling. One Tuesday, his brother Samuel stopped by the office. The two of them reviewed expansion plans before grabbing lunch like they always had. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked. Daniel looked out the window for a moment before replying, "No, that was it. No anger, no need for revenge." The plan had worked exactly as intended. He had built his defenses years before Melissa entered his life. Not because he was bitter, but because he had learned the hard way what love without protection could cost. Grace Fulton, the lawyer who had executed the plan to perfection, called with one final update. Melissa was dating again. Her new boyfriend was a recently divorced pharmaceutical rep with a house in the suburbs and a good income. "Predictable," Grace said. Daniel didn't respond. He just thanked her and hung up. Across town, Melissa sat at her small kitchen table, staring at overdue bills and trying to remember what it felt like to be powerful. She had once imagined herself flying to Miami, dressed in designer clothes, sipping champagne with Jason. Now she drank store-brand coffee from a chipped mug and wondered if she could sell her handbags without anyone finding out. The worst part wasn't losing the money. It was knowing that Daniel had seen it coming the entire time, that he never once yelled, begged, or tried to make her stay. He let her dig her own grave and simply refused to jump in with her. Melissa learned something she'd never had to consider before. Regret doesn't need drama to hurt. Sometimes it just sits quietly in the room, reminding you of every decision you made for the wrong reasons. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to his routines. Work, family, growth. He didn't celebrate Melissa's downfall because he didn't need to. He hadn't won anything. He'd simply protected what was already his. And that was enough. It didn't take long for Melissa Whitaker's life to settle into a pattern she had never imagined for herself. She went from planning luxury vacations to tracking grocery store discounts. She no longer scrolled real estate listings for oceanfront condos, but instead compared job listings that offered benefits. And even those were slim. The last of the divorce settlement had evaporated, drained by legal fees, short-term comforts, and a refusal to accept how far she'd actually fallen. Her resume, padded with vague roles in event planning and brand consulting, got no traction. Eventually, she accepted part-time work at a boutique cosmetic counter inside a shopping mall. It paid less than she'd ever made, but gave her just enough to get by, barely. Jason was gone for good. She never heard from him again, and a part of her was relieved. When she thought about it honestly, he'd never cared about her. He'd been chasing the money just like she had. The only difference was that Jason ran when things collapsed, while she had to live with the aftermath. She avoided conversations about Daniel whenever they came up. But words still found her. The business was thriving. Whitaker Brothers Construction had expanded into 3 more states. Daniel had become a speaker at local entrepreneur forums, often invited to talk about resilience and smart financial planning. She knew he never mentioned her by name, but the story was unmistakable. One of Melissa's former friends ran into Daniel at a gala and later texted her, "You really underestimated him." Melissa didn't reply. She didn't need to. That single sentence echoed the truth she now lived with. Daniel hadn't needed to raise his voice, throw accusations, or exact revenge in the traditional sense. His strength was in his restraint, his foresight, his refusal to play emotional games. He had learned from past failure, and instead of becoming paranoid or bitter, he had become prepared. He never gloated. He never reached out to say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The silence was enough. One evening after a long shift at the mall, Melissa stopped by a gas station and ran into someone she barely recognized. Samuel Whitaker, Daniel's brother. He was polite, kind even. They exchanged brief pleasantries. Before walking away, he looked at her and said quietly, "You had every chance not to end up here." She nodded. No excuses, no defense, just agreement. Because he was right. Melissa had once believed she was playing a clever game, trading up, building her future on someone else's success, but she never saw the full picture. Daniel had been 10 steps ahead the entire time. Not because he was vengeful, but because he was smart enough to protect what mattered. Back at her apartment, Melissa sat alone and replayed everything in her head. The early days, the growing distance, the lies she told herself to justify cheating, the belief that Jason would be her way out. Each memory hit harder now that the consequences had landed. What stung most wasn't the money, it was the realization that she'd thrown away a life that could have worked. Daniel had never mistreated her. He was focused, driven, maybe too quiet at times. But he was loyal. He trusted her. She had traded that trust for a fantasy. Now she understood something too late. Relationships aren't built on attention or excitement. They're built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. She had gambled that Daniel would break when she walked away. Instead, she was the one left picking up the pieces. Daniel, for his part, never looked back. After the court case, he focused solely on what came next. He and Samuel expanded the company, Grace Fulton became a permanent advisor, and Daniel started mentoring young business owners who'd faced personal setbacks. If people asked about Melissa, he'd say, "It didn't work out," and move on. His personal life remained private. He dated occasionally, but cautiously. He never allowed someone into his life again without understanding their character, not just their charm. He still believed in love, but now it came with boundaries. Daniel knew the value of protecting his work, his family, and most importantly, his peace. He didn't need revenge because he already had what Melissa and Jason were chasing: security, independence, and control over his own life. In the end, Melissa's fall wasn't because of Daniel. It was because she built her future on entitlement, not effort. She thought wealth came from proximity, not participation. She believed love could be manipulated and consequences avoided. She was wrong. Daniel's story wasn't about winning. It was about preparation, patience, and knowing your worth, quietly, without needing to prove it to anyone. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't punishment, it's peace.